What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today, we're going to be working on a 2008 BMW E83 X3. Today on the X3 behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace your front suspension, meaning we're going to be replacing the struts and all the components that go along with it. In front of me, we have a Sachs OE kit, which is available on fcpeuro.com. It includes new struts, all the coil spring insulator. We have new bump stops, new hardware, as well as new strut mounts and bellows. Everything you're going to need except for the coil springs themselves. Typically, those are going to last the lifetime of the vehicle. However, they are available if you're looking to replace yours. In addition to that, we have gone ahead and added some sway bar end links, as we're going to be working on those as well. We're going to be removing them from the old struts, so we may as well replace them while we're in there. And oftentimes they can be responsible for some of the noise you may hear in your front suspension. As your suspension grows old, the bushings wear out, the bump stops wear out, the pressure inside the struts wear out, so they get a little bit noisy, they can get a little bit clunky, and as they get really worse, they'll get bouncy. So driving the X3 behind me, it's like having the Globetrotters at each front wheel. Every time we hit a bump, it's just brrr. So they're definitely due for replacement. Another thing to note is whenever you're doing this, you want to make sure that you have the proper tools, which we're going to cover in a moment. And on top of that, we always recommend you replace these in pairs. You never want to do one side alone. If one side has failed, then more than likely the other one's going to follow through. Now, before we get started on the DIY, let's take a look at those tools we're going to need for this job. And now for tools. For this DIY, we're going to be using two different size torque wrenches. I have both a 3/8 drive and a 1/2-inch drive torque wrench. Same thing applies for our ratchets. We have a 1/2-inch drive and 3/8 drive ratchet. I have a couple wrenches in front of me, which I'm going to be using for the sway bar end links and as a counter hole tool. I have a 20 mil, an 18 mil, and a 16 mil wrench. A normal socket set is going to be needed for this DIY as well. Specifically, we're using a couple different 16s. We have a 13 millimeter in front of us. We also have a 17 millimeter socket for our wheel lug bolts. We have a 22, which is going to be specifically used for the spring compressor tool, which I'll talk about in a moment. If you're not using that tool, don't worry about the 22. And then the locking nuts on our Sachs struts, both on the old units and the new ones, are 21 millimeter. So we're going to have a 21 millimeter socket for that as well. Moving forward, we have a small flathead screwdriver, which will be used as a small pry tool. We recommend a pass-through socket set whenever you're doing any suspension work on any vehicle. These are really handy because you can use a counter hole tool at the same time, especially when you're torquing down your nylon locking nut for the top of your struts or shocks when you're installing your new mount. So keep that in mind. If you don't have that, it is not impossible to do the job. You just may want to use a combo of a wrench and a hex bit or Torx, depending on what your vehicle has. But a pass-through socket set is the way to go. A big hammer is always going to be handy, especially when you're working on a rusty vehicle. Some bungee cords are nice to kind of keep the hub in place once you remove the strut out of the assembly. That way it's not just hanging and putting a lot of tension on your brake hose or your axle. And then moving over, we have some power tools, which are always just nice. They're not necessary by any means for these DIYs, but they make the install and removal of big rusty hardware a lot easier. Some anti-seize or liquid moly ceramic paste will be great. We recommend using that when you're installing your new struts so they don't seize to the knuckle. And then today we're going to be using this McPherson style spring compressor tool. There's a couple different variations of these tools out there. That's going to be probably the most important tool needed for this job. If you do not have one of these at home and you don't feel like using one, or you're not comfortable using one, you can easily take your old struts and your new hardware over to your local independent shop, have them assemble them for you. The money you're saving on the DIY can go towards that. So it's definitely good, safe practice if you don't have the proper equipment to do this job at home. So one more thing to note, if you're working on the garage floor or the driveway, you're gonna need an extra floor jack that's free to help compress everything together when you're tightening down everything at ride height. If you're working on the lift like we are today, a screw jack will come in handy. Now we've got our tools covered. Let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, we have the X3 up in the air. Today we're going to be working on the front passenger side of the vehicle. However, the steps are going to be identical for both the driver and passenger side, with the exception of your brake pad wear sensor that runs through the strut. We'll show you what I mean when we get to that point. But to get started, we're going to start by removing our wheel. We have 5 17 millimeter lug bolts that we're going to remove. If you're working at home and you don't have a lift or you don't have an impact gun, make sure you break these free before you raise up the vehicle. use a breaker bar, break them free on the ground, then go ahead and raise your vehicle up and remove them the rest of the way. Now that we have our wheel off, we can see our strut. This one has already leaked in the past. You can tell by how much crud is caked onto it. The oil is a little bit dried up, but we'll take you over to the driver's side real quick and show you what a freshly leaking strut looks like. All right, gang, real quick over on the driver's side, like I mentioned, you can see this strut is clearly visibly leaking compared to the one on the passenger side. There is a ton of grime and buildup around the brake line. Same thing at the base where it goes onto the knuckle, which you'll see in a moment. So just another great thing you can do is simply pop off your wheel, do a visual inspection, see how everything looks. In this case, we have a leaky strut and we have a destroyed bump stop up top, which we'll show you closely in just a moment. But with that, let's head back over to the passenger side and continue on this DIY. All right, now that we had a quick look at the driver's side, we can continue on with the DIY here. First things first is we're gonna free up any lines that run through our strut body. So we have a soft line for our brake caliper hose, as well as an ABS cable. So let's go ahead and free those up. If you're doing the driver's side, you're gonna have both the ABS and the brake pad wear sensor cable. So just keep that in mind. They're two different sizes. They only fit on one notch. You have two tabs, one on the front of the strut body and one on the rear of the strut body that hold both cables in place. So let's pop that off first. We'll start with the front one. Simply pull it towards you, rotate it a bit, and it comes right out. Follow the cable to the back side. Then you can release it from the back bracket as well. Also, one thing to note is the orientation of these cables. For the passenger side, it routes behind the strut. It's going to be the same thing for the driver's side. You just want to make sure the cables go back in the same way or kind of stay in the same general area. Moving over to our soft line for our brake system, we have there is a metal clip under all this crud that we just simply pop off. Two small ears. Here's a better look at that clip. You want to make sure you clean this up before you reinstall it. And then this rubber grommet simply slides back off of the strut body. We'll go ahead and clean all that debris off of it as well. Now we have that situated. The next thing we're going to do while we're in this area right here is work on removing the top nut that holds our sway bar end link to the strut body. Then we'll come underneath and we'll work on the rest. So let's go ahead and get ready for that. I'm gonna go ahead and break the nut first free on the sway bar end link using a 16mm socket. Depending on what brand you have on the vehicle, I think these are original as the Struts are. Sometimes they will have a counterhold, either a Torx or a hex, and then you can use a a counterhold and wrench combo to remove them. These don't have that, so we're gonna be using a 16mm to break the nut free first. Use a 16 to break this nut free. Then we're gonna use thin wrenches would be preferred here. We don't have those. So I'm gonna use a 20mm wrench and just shove it between the boot and the backing of the strut body. Keep in mind, if you are not replacing these sway bar end links, you wanna be very careful how you install this wrench. You don't wanna damage the seal on the boot and then cause the grease to leak out or rip the boot. So we're gonna be replacing them. I'm not gonna be too worried about them, but that is something you have to keep in mind if you are not replacing them. Also, if you're having any issues removing any hardware, penetrating fluid is always going to be your friend whenever you're working on old rusty suspension, especially if you live in the Rust Belt. Go ahead and hit that with your favorite penetrant of choice. Let it sit for a few minutes, and then you can go ahead and start your job. All right, with the top of the sway bar end link removed, now we can go ahead and get underneath the X3 and we'll work on removing the lower one. So let's do that next. All right, now that we're under the X3, our next step is gonna be to disconnect the other end of the sway bar end link that connects to our sway bar. If you are not replacing these, go ahead and skip this step now, but otherwise we're gonna repeat the same process that we did up top. We have a 16mm socket. You can use a wrench as well. And for right now, I'm gonna counter hold with a 20. That's what I can seem to fit in here to kind of hold the two flat spots, which I'll show you in a moment. So here's 16, 20. Let me give you a better look at the flat spots on these style sway bar end links. Again, sometimes like the Mila units will use a counter hold. The counter hold on these is on the inside near the bushing, or near the ball joint, I should say. You can see on the old sway bar here, there are two flat spots, one on either end of the stud that would sit on the interior, either against the strut or the sway bar, depending on what end you're working on. Now, obviously the 20mm wrench I was using is way too big, but because I'm jamming it in there, it helps kind of sync everything together. Ideally, you'd want a thin wrench set for these, but you can make it work with a regular wrench. Now we have our sway bar end link removed. The next step we're going to go ahead and perform is strictly only applicable to vehicles with adaptive headlights. You can see right up above me, we have a headlight level sensor. We're going to go ahead and disconnect the lower rod that connects to our lower control arm. So for that, we'll need a 10mm socket and a small wrench to counter hold. Again, if you do not have adaptive style headlights, then this will not apply to you. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect this lower headlight level sensor. As I mentioned, I'm using a 10mm socket and an 8mm wrench to counter hold the back side of here. Sometimes these can get kind of seized up, and if you just break the nut free, you can risk damaging the rod sensor or the rod itself. So I'll keep that from spinning on one end with a small wrench while I remove the 10mm nut on the other side. The reason we're doing this is because we are going to loosen up the inner bolt for this lower control arm. That's going to allow this whole assembly to drop down enough for us to remove the strut body from the spindle. All right, with that freed up, I'm going to pull the rod out. And I'm simply going to put the 10mm nut back on it just so I don't lose it or misplace it. All right. Now I'm going to go ahead and loosen up this lower control arm hardware. This is going to allow the whole assembly to drop down easier when we're going to free up the strut from the spindle. So we have a 16mm head bolt and an 18mm nut. Using a wrench or socket combo, you can go ahead and break this free. The reason you want to do that is you don't want to fight the rubber bushing in here and have everything kind of spring back up. You don't want to risk damaging the bushing either. So I'm going to use a 16mm wrench to counter hold. And I'll use an 18mm on a ratchet to go ahead and break that free. We're not going to remove it all the way. We're simply just loosening everything up. Cool. All right, my good people, now that we have that nice and freed up, the next step for us is going to be to undo this pinch bolt. So for that, same size for hardware, we have an 18mm nut and a 16mm head bolt. So let's go ahead and work on breaking that free. Now to undo this pinch bolt a little bit easier, I'm going to use the impact gun. I'm going to cheat a little bit and just zap it out, but you can still use a large 1/2-inch ratchet, just like we did with the lower control arm bolt, and break that free. Counter holding with a 16mm wrench. And we'll go ahead and just zap this out. We'll rotate the head of the bolt on the other side a little bit, just to kind of free it up. All right, that one's gonna be a little bit seized in there, which makes sense. This car has high mileage and it's a bit rusty. I'm just gonna use the gun to loosen it up. We are replacing this hardware, so we're not too worried about damaging it, but I'm just gonna use a 16 and kind of give it a quick zap to free it, break any rust free that's holding it in. Now we're going to go ahead and get our spreader tool ready to go. This is a socket bit on a 3/8 drive ratchet. We're going to go ahead and place it directly in this slit right here in the back of the spindle and strut. And the goal for that is to open everything up just enough so that the strut can hopefully come out without too much of a fight. So I'm going to get that situated in here. It's an oval shape, so it's not, you can easily overshoot it. Just go ahead and do it again. Like I just did, I just overshot it. We'll go ahead and replace it. Okay. We can leave the ratchet attached. Now, our goal is gonna be to get, for us, a little bit more eye level with the car since we're on the lift, and work on separating the spindle assembly from the strut. So we'll catch you in just a sec and we'll get to it. All right, my good people. At this point, for those of you following along at home, if you're working on the garage floor or the driveway, you wanna get your floor jack ready to go. And by that, I mean you're gonna wanna position it underneath your spindle assembly, perhaps the lower control arm, and just get ready to brace this whole assembly once you free it from the strut. Because we are working on the lift and I don't have a screw jack that is short enough and we're gonna be going up and down with the vehicle, I'm gonna use something a little bit different. I'm gonna use some bungee cords and a lug bolt. And what I'm gonna do with that is I'm gonna use a lug bolt kind of as an anchor point, and then that'll stay there. And then once we separate this whole assembly, I'm just gonna use 2 bungee cords to kind of hold everything together so we're not putting too much strain on the axle. That's the main goal here. You don't wanna pop the axle out of anywhere or damage a CV joint. Otherwise, you're in big trouble. So just keep that in mind. This will be our anchor point since we don't have a floor jack at the moment to support everything with. Once we lower the car down, we can go ahead and slide one underneath. You can go ahead and give it a shot by simply just wiggling this assembly off from the strut body. As you can see, me wiggling it alone is enough to break this seal free and bring this down a bit. Now I still have my spreader tool back there. I just removed the ratchet in case the whole thing falls. If slow and steady isn't your style, you can grab a big hammer like the one that we have out and use that to kind of course everything out quicker. In this case, I'm just gonna go ahead and reinstall the spreader tool as it popped out. It may not be needed at this point anymore as it's come out enough, but it doesn't hurt to just have it in position, ready to go. Now, the reason I'm trying to continue going just by hand is so I don't put any additional stress on the axle once it does break free. But if I can avoid it, I will. If not, we'll go back to the hammer. All right. That was easy. So this is why you want to support everything. Our lower control arm bolt is undone, obviously. So this is just going to hang. So you don't want to put any stress on the brake line and any additional items as well as our axle. So I'll go ahead and have Mark help me real quick and we'll get our bungee cord set up. So with my 2 bungee cords here, you can see how I'm using the lug bolt as an anchor. We have them going in 2 different directions just to keep some of the strain off. Now we're going to go ahead and get in the engine bay and we'll show you what to remove next so we can pull this old crusty strut out. All right, my good people, back up top of things, we're going to get ready to pull the strut out. First, I'm going to use my small flathead screwdriver and just pop this dust cap off. It's not critical to do now, but it makes life easier. With that dust cover off, we have 3 13mm nuts that hold this strut in place. Before I pull those off, I'm going to want to go ahead, and I recommend you do this as well. I'm just going to go ahead and mark them with a Sharpie just to have their relative location for when I go to install the new hardware. There is slotted holes up here, so there's a little bit of camber adjustment. So in order to have the least funky ride when you put everything back together and go to the alignment shop, which you will have to do after this video or after this job, we're just gonna go ahead and make some guide marks here so that we can kind of have everything close to where it was at the beginning before we removed any parts. You don't have to get too fancy with it. I'm just doing a couple Sharpie marks. Obviously the adjustment goes this way, so try to keep that in mind when you make your lines. If you don't want to use a Sharpie, use a dry erase marker, anything that you can wipe off afterwards if you don't like seeing the lines there. Now we'll take a 13mm socket and just break all 3 nuts free. For those of you with an eagle eye, you can see this strut mount does not have the alignment pin up top here on the inboard 13mm nut. Our new ones will, so that will just help you kind of install these in the proper direction, if you will. All right, now that I have all 3 nice and loose, I'm just gonna switch over to the electric ratchet. And then what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna grab the strut assembly from underneath in the fender well. I'm gonna hold it with one hand while I go ahead and remove the last nut with my other hand. If you have a second set of hands, go ahead and call that friend over now and have them hold the strut for you, or remove the 13mm nut. It'll make life a little bit easier. All right, so we got our strut ready to go. And here is this crusty old strut assembly. You can see this open hole on the top of this mount. This one does not have a pin. The driver's side does, so this may have been replaced at some point. Regardless, our new one has the dowel pin, so that'll make install a little bit easier. But for now, let's head over to the vise. We'll show you how to disassemble and assemble your new strut, and we'll come back over here and install it. All right, my good people, over at the vise, we're gonna go ahead and work on dismantling our strut, our old strut, so we can save our coil spring and reuse it. Again, I know I mentioned this before, but if you do not have the right tools for this, or you don't feel comfortable doing this at home, take it to a shop, bring your new parts with them, and they can disassemble this for you and reassemble your new struts for you with the new hardware that you provide them with. It'll take them a little bit of time. And the money that you're saving doing this yourself at home is worth investing the 50, 60 bucks that they may charge you to assemble these for you. Now, if you have the right tools, then let's get to it. Now we're gonna grab our spring compressor tool. We're gonna go ahead and compress this coil so that we can go ahead and remove our old strut mount. So with that, I'll get the tool set up. All right. So we're only gonna be able to get about 2 coils on here, but we'll see how far that gets us. All right. At this point, we cannot compress anymore. Our tool is maxed out, but this feels really nice and loose, so we should be able to go ahead and remove that now. Obviously, we're going to be very mindful of this. As we remove this, the whole coil spring may swing around at us, so just be careful. Now we're going to grab our pass-through socket set. We have a 21mm socket for the nut that holds the mount to the strut. Our new hardware is going to be about the same. So we got our 21 ready to release. Then we have our 6mm hex that we're going to use to counter hold with. I'm going to use a 1/2" drive ratchet to do that. And now we simply want to break the nut loose. Should be able to hang there. Just let the weight of the ratchet do the counter holding here. If you have a second friend or a buddy that can help you with this, this is usually the best time to call them over. Not everyone has a vise, so I'm working by myself today, so today the vise will be my friend. There's that. You can see there's still a teeny bit of tension on there, which is why this is so sketchy. Sometimes you want to be very careful whenever you're doing this. Now, before I take anything off, we're going to pay close attention as to how everything is coming off. So we have our strut mount, locking nut is out. Underneath the strut mount, we have a small washer that kind of keeps the debris out of the grease part of the bearing. We have a new one that comes with the mount. Then we have our washer. You'll notice the rounded side is facing upwards. The flat side is down towards the top of the coil spring plate. We're going to go ahead and pull this off. The top of the coil plate, we're going to go ahead and reuse. We're just going to replace the insulator pad on it, which comes with our kit. And now I'm going to go ahead and gently remove the spring compressor tool from the spring. We'll go ahead and clean it up, and then we'll show you how to set up your new strut. But here you can see our old unit. It's really bad. It's really leaky. The bump stop is disintegrating. There's nothing left to it. The bellows are usually reusable unless they're torn. So if you don't want to replace them and yours are in good shape, you can go ahead and clean them up and reuse those. So let me go ahead and get the spring cleaned up. We'll get our new strut in the vise and we'll show you how to assemble it. I'm in the middle of disassembling the old strut, and I just wanted to show you how bad these are. I think these are the worst struts I've ever done. This should not be doable. I shouldn't be able to do this at all. I should require almost my whole body weight, if not more, to compress these. And these are completely shot. So if you're taking yours apart and yours are doing this, then you have a smoking gun. Your struts are blown. But with that said, let me finish assembling the strut, and I'll catch you back over here in a moment. All right, my good people, we have swapped the old strut in for the new one. Now, one thing to mind for those of you that are using a vise at home, the goal here is not to crush the gas compressed strut here is simply just to keep it in place so it's not dancing around on you. So if you are using a vise, don't squeeze it too much. You could risk damaging it or hurting yourself. So let's just be wary of that. So now with our fresh strut, we can go ahead and grab our lower coil spring insulator. These are reusable oftentimes, but we have the kit from Saks, so we're going to go ahead and replace everything that we can while we're doing this. These are notched in a way that they only go in one direction. So you can see it's kind of gonna butt up with the bottom of the strut right here. It's got a little dip, just like the bottom of the strut plate does. So go ahead and place that like that. We're gonna go ahead and remove our nut, which we'll use at the end of this. From here, we can go ahead and grab our bellow and get that ready for install along with a new bump stop. There is a ridge on the bump stop that you can key into the bellow. Same thing with the bottom of the strut here. There is a small ridge on this plastic cap that you can use to key in the bellow there. That way it keeps everything nice and closed from the elements as far as the shaft goes, so you don't get any debris in there over time. We'll just go ahead and pop this into place. Now we'll go ahead and slide the bellow on with the bump stop, and we'll just work it over this cover until we can get it down to the bottom and key it in to the bottom of the strut. And with that, our bellow is good to go. It's not going to go anywhere. So from there, we can go ahead and grab our upper spring perch and go ahead and install the new insulator pad on that as well. Similar to the bottom one, it has a small dip. This is where the top of the coil spring butts up to, so it only goes in one way. And now we can grab our coil spring, which we have just cleaned up. And just to show you, before we put our spring in the spring compressor tool, the coil springs usually have a flat stop at the end of them. So here's the bottom portion, it's a little bit wider on the E83, and the top is usually a lot more narrow. Same thing, flat stop. So the bottom of that coil spring is gonna butt up onto the stopper right here on your coil spring shim. If you pay attention to the old one, when you pulled it off, you'll see it's the same. So I'll keep that in place there. And at the top, your spring plate with the shim also has a small stop in it, which butts up with the coil spring up top. So that's how you know that it's going to be quote unquote keyed in properly when you go to assemble everything. Let me get this top spring. Have this top spring plate and shim on top. Okay. Now we can get our mount on there as well. Here's our new mount. There's the exposed bearing, which you want to replace the dust washer for, dust cap. And before that goes on, we have our new washer, which also comes with the kit. These are reusable. They don't really wear, but we have a new one, so we'll install it. Flat face towards the top of the spring plate, the curved part towards the top of the strut mount. All right, so not quite there yet. We'll go ahead and compress the spring just a bit more. We'll pull this off for now. And we'll go ahead and compress a bit more. Spring plate back up top. Again, spring shim already installed on that. We have our washer, curved portion towards the top. We have our dust cap washer on the bottom of our mount. There we go. Now we can go ahead and grab our new nut, and we'll start that one by hand. And I'm just gonna grab the 21mm socket and start that as much as I can before I remove the spring compressor tool. All right. Now with everything still loosely in place, I'm gonna use my counterhold tool and the 21mm nut and just snug this top nut up a bit more before I remove the spring compressor tool. So we have our 6mm hex that we're gonna use to counterhold with. All right. And then I'm just literally gonna wedge this ratchet next to the spring compressor tool. Again, this is where a friend will come in handy just to kind of help you hold these things. This is a little bit awkward sometimes. That can go away. One last look at our spring shim down below and up top to make sure everything is happy and it's the right place. And now we can go ahead and remove the spring compressor tool. Slowly, of course. All right. Make sure to check everything before you put that tool away. I'm looking at the bottom here. That looks good. I'm looking at the top. My coil spring is butting up at the flat spot on my coil spring plate and shim. Now we can go ahead and grab our 21 and our 6mm hex and just work on snugging these up a bit more before we give them a final torque of 64 Newton meters. So for this, I'm gonna switch over to a regular 21mm socket. I'll set my torque wrench to 64, and then everything should be tight enough where we don't have to worry about counter holding for the final torque. If we do, and the whole shaft is just spinning on us, we'll grab our two tools and snug them up a bit more before we put the torque wrench on them. For the final torque, I'm gonna have my friend Mark kind of hold everything together for me. I don't wanna crush the strut with the vise, so we can give it the final 64 Newton meter torque. I heard it there, let's give it one more. Beautiful. Thank you, Mark. Also included in the kit are new dust caps for the top of the strut. They keep the top portion of the bearing clean, free of any debris. These are reusable items. If yours are missing, then you want to go ahead and replace them. Our kit includes them, so we'll go ahead and install a nice fresh cap. I'll just use a socket to snug it into its home. And then last but not least, we'll point this out again during the install, but you'll notice your old strut, hopefully, and your new strut mount have a locating dowel on the top of the strut mount here. This is gonna make sure that these go in the same way they came out. They technically only go in one way. So pay attention to that when you install, but we'll highlight that back at the X3. So our strut is fully built. Let's jump over to the X3 and continue on this DIY. All right, my good people, we have our new strut assembly ready to go. We reused our coil spring, just gave them a little wipe down. There's two small alignment dowels here as well that we need to pay attention to. These are gonna go in the split portion of the spindle. That's what kind of guides and aligns the strut to our vehicle. So just keep those in mind. But for now, let's go ahead and swing this in from underneath, and then we'll start our new 3 13mm nuts up top. These are locking nuts, so they're only gonna go so far. So you need to grab the tool, socket, and ratchet to snug them up. Now we have them just snug up by hand. I'm gonna grab the electric ratchet just to snug them up the rest of the way, making sure I use my marks so everything's kind of in the same alignment again, using that pin, making sure that goes in the proper spot, and then we'll torque them down properly. I'm gonna guide the strut from underneath with one hand while I snug them up top with the other. So you can see our marks aren't perfect. That's why we're gonna take it to get aligned, but gives us a rough idea of how far off it may be. Now we're gonna grab our torque wrench and torque these down to 34 Newton meters. All right, then we'll hit them with a little paint pen action, just so we know these are all finalized. Again, this will probably change once it gets aligned, but for now, for our sake, we know those are done. Now let's get back in the wheel well of things and we'll get ready to mate the spindle to the strut. All right, back eye level with everything here. We're gonna work on getting our spindle onto our new strut. I've already gone ahead and simply just cleaned the inside of it. You can use some emery cloth, you can use some sandpaper, a wire wheel on a drill attachment, but the goal is to clean the inside of the spindle where this shaft sits. Then from there, it's up to you to use your anti-seize of choice. I'm gonna use just some regular Permatex anti-seize. You can use liquid moly ceramic paste. You can use some copper anti-seize, whatever you like. The goal is here is that next time you do this job, these will come out even easier, considering these didn't really fight us today, but this will definitely help. So I'm just gonna coat the bottom of the shaft a bit and the inside of the spindle. Don't need to go crazy with it. I'm just gonna do the bottom half and then it'll spread as it goes in. All right. You wanna make sure our ABS cable and your brake pad wear sensor cable, if you're on the driver's side, remains tucked in the same direction that it was. In this case, passenger side would be behind the strut. Same thing on the driver's side, you wanna make sure it's behind the strut. And then from here, I'm just gonna get my screw jack situated. For those of you working on the ground at home, just get ready to get your floor jack, set it up underneath your lower ball joint. And we'll just slowly start raising everything. What I'm doing right now is I'm making sure both pins align into the spindle, and then we can pretty much just go up until this bottoms out on its own. Right now that it started to bottom out, we can go ahead and feed our new pinch bolt in. We'll send that through. Give it a couple coercive taps with the hammer. Right now I'm just gonna have to reposition that spreader tool as it is in the way of my bolt going in, but we'll go ahead and reposition that if we need to. But since our strut was all the way in, really no need for it. But if you're seeing that the second pin isn't going in all the way, reposition your spreader tool and then get your pinch bolt started. Now that our strut is fully into our spindle, we have our pinch bolt just finger started. We're gonna go ahead and set everything at ride height so we can start tightening down our hardware. So for that, I'm just gonna go ahead and raise this up. Now, if you're wondering how to set ride height, what you can do from the start is simply measure the distance of the center of the axle or the center of your wheel or the wheel still on to the edge of the fender. Something roughly close is gonna be good. And then from there, you can go ahead and remeasure with the wheel off once you're setting ride height like we are right now. For us, we're just gonna use the screw jack to basically take the load off the vehicle on this corner of the lift. And then once we reach that, we can go ahead and snug all our hardware down. We can go ahead and lose these bungee cords. All right. At this point, we're gonna go ahead and retighten down our inner control arm bolt. That was a 16mm head and an 18mm nut. We're gonna go ahead and torque that down to 100 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. So let's go ahead and do that now. We have our torque wrench set to 100 Newton meters. We're gonna do the initial 100, then we'll do the additional 90. Now, yes, one thing to note, you should always replace these torque to yield bolts. We are gonna be doing a control arm down the road on this X3. So at that point, we'll do all new hardware, new control arms, all that good stuff. But for now, we'll go ahead and just tighten this down to 100 Newton meters, counter hold with a 16mm wrench. And those of you that have a headlight level sensor, make sure that your bracket is in the same position it was before you tighten down this nut. There's our initial 100. I'm gonna paint mark to the top of the nut so that I know once it's rotated 90 degrees, you can use a Sharpie or something similar, or just make a little notch in it with a screwdriver, maybe a little scratch into the rust, whatever you have. Then we'll do the final 90. All right, now we have that final 90. If you want, you can go ahead and paint mark everything just so you can see that nothing's moved down the road. While I have you down here, again, these are for vehicles with adaptive headlights. We're gonna resecure our level sensor rod to the lower control arm. That was a small 8mm wrench. You use a small set of pliers and a 10mm either wrench or socket to tighten down the nut. So I got my 8mm wrench just kind of holding the flat spots on that rod. And then I have my 10mm socket just to tighten down the 10mm nut. We're just gonna snug these down really gently. It's going into a plastic head. Doesn't really need to be too tight. No more than 6 to 8 Newton meters for those of you that want to torque it down at home. And then last but not least, while we have everything still under the proper ride height, we're gonna go ahead and tighten down our pinch bolt. Again, same 16, 18 millimeter combo. We're gonna torque this down to 100 Newton meters. So, you know the drill, my good people. I'm gonna hit it with the paint mark. Now that the critical hardware is all tightened down at ride height, we can go ahead and get rid of the screw jack, get a little bit more eye level with things, and we'll finish up this DIY by reinstalling our sway bar end link, the rest of the miscellaneous cabling, and our wheel. All right, my good people, I lied. Before we get truly eye level with everything, we're gonna install the bottom portion of our sway bar end link. You wanna make sure you position it properly. It only goes on one way. And you pay attention to the hardware that comes with it or the hardware that you took off. You have the nut with the built-in washer. That one's gonna go up top in the strut. And then you have the regular locking nut. That one's gonna go down below on the sway bar end link. Just gonna slip it through the hole up top there. Let that hang out there. We'll get that situated there. And we'll go ahead and start the nut by hand. And then I'll use the electric ratchet to see if I can snug it up any further. Probably gonna start spinning the ball joint, which if it does, I'll go ahead and stop right away. Yep, again, 16 millimeter nut. Now for the install, I like to use a 18 millimeter wrench. It's just a little bit smaller, grabs the flat spots a little bit easier. We don't kind of have that original sandwiching of the removal that kind of helped everything from spinning. So we need a smaller size wrench for this. Again, being mindful of the boots. We don't want to damage the boots or pop the snap rings off that hold the grease in. Now we have our nut snugged up. We're gonna go ahead and torque it down to 64 Newton meters. Beautiful. We'll go ahead and paint mark it. Not necessary, but I like to keep track of what I've torqued down already. And with that, we can go ahead and get eye level for real this time with everything else. We'll button up the top end of our sway bar end link. We'll reroute our ABS cable and our brake line. All right, continuing with the sway bar end of things, we're gonna go ahead and finalize the hardware up top. Simply gonna start it by hand, same thing. Then we're gonna go ahead and use the electric ratchet and some pressure from behind just to get a couple more threads. Keep that brake line off in the meantime so you can get your tool in here. All right, now we'll switch over to our 18 millimeter wrench just to do some counter holding here. All right, with that snugged up, we'll give it the final torque of 64 Newton meters. There we go. Give it the old mark. With that situated, we can resecure our soft line to the strut. We have our clip that we cleaned up from earlier. This was pretty grimy if you remember from all the old leakage from the old strut body. So we'll go ahead and slide that in. All right. And with that secured, next we can go ahead and resecure our ABS sensor and your brake pad wear sensor if you're on the driver's side. I made a boo-boo. I ran the line through the wrong side of the end link. No big deal. You can just disconnect it up at the junction box and reconnect it. If you do that, you don't have to worry about taking off the sway bar end link again. But just keep in mind, you note that orientation before you bolt everything down. Now we can go ahead and resecure the ABS sensor starting at the back and moving it over to the front. And with that, my good people, we can go ahead and reinstall our wheel and button up this DIY. Always start your lug bolts by hand. You never want to risk cross-threading them or damaging the hub. Such a simple, easy mistake, easily avoidable just by taking a few seconds to do it by hand. And now we can go ahead and lower it back on the ground and give them the final torque. All right, my good people, we're gonna give our lug bolts the final torque. We have our torque wrench set to 90 foot-pounds or 122 Newton meters. And with that, my good people, that is going to wrap up the DIY for today. Overall, a pretty straightforward job on the E83. Again, the most difficult and, if you will, stressful thing is compressing the coil springs to disassemble your old struts and swap them over to your new struts. So if you do not have that tool, please just take it, go get them done somewhere, get them assembled, then you can pick up the DIY from where you left off and continue on. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, or there's a specific job you want to see us do on the E83, leave that in the comment section below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.